live.
Yeah, awesome.
Sounds good.
So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome here to this live webinar. We have guests from all over the world, right? We have Cornell from Singapore, Sophia from the US. So, and it's a pleasure really again to have you all here. Today we are going to discuss about object-oriented UX or OOUX and how and what kind of role it could play in the future of design as a whole. But as you know, here at Twitter we always like to talk about XR design, so we're gonna have a little bit of an eye on that new world of creativity, so to say. But enough of me talking. Why don't we introduce our guest, Cornell? Oh, actually no, ladies first. Sophia. Why don't you tell us?
Yeah, sure. And are we recording now? I don't see the recording.
Yes,
we're recording.
we are live.
Very cool.
We are live.
All right. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I am Sophia Prater, and I am here in Atlanta, Georgia, or right outside of Atlanta, Georgia, actually, the North Georgia mountains. I consider myself the chief evangelist for object-oriented UX. I think I get credit for coining the term, not object-oriented UI. That was being thrown around a whole lot in the 90s. But in 2015, I read an article on A List Apart called Object-Oriented UX that got a lot of traction. And basically since then, it has over the years turned into my full-time job to teach object-oriented UX through my certification course, the master class where I teach individuals. And I also go into companies like Facebook and Delta and MasterCard, recently Adobe, and go and I teach their design teams object-oriented UX so that they can apply it in their work.
Fantastic. And we're going to know more about what that actually implies, right? And what is actually some example to understand a little bit about what it is and how it could help actually design. So, Cornell, what about you? Tell us.
Yes, hi, my name is Cornell. I'm a CG artist and XR designer in Singapore, so originally from Germany. And so I'm also the author of Unreal for mobile and standalone VR, which came out in 2019, which is, focused on building, applications for mobile headsets using the Unreal Engine. Introduction to visual scripting, and basically it's a book for non-coders. So it's basically for non-coders to build application without coding, only using visual scripting. And so I have an upcoming book called UX for XR, which is coming out in June, so basically very soon. And in this book, I look at all the different, platforms, technologies, techniques, standards, learnings, and while doing the research for the book, I discovered OOUX, so basically, and I thought, man, this is the missing link, because the reason why I think OOUX is a missing link for UX design in XR is because the UX design process, as we know it for mobile and web applications, which has been a tremendous success story in the digital economy. It's such a fine-tuned and successful formula. To bring this success formula into the XR world, is not as easy as it seems. Because it's kind of, we have a different environment to develop applications for XR. We have different problems, and thinking object-oriented kind of helps us to bridge between these worlds. So basically, object-oriented helps us to stay more on an abstract layer, and instead of like going right into UI, how people do it very often, and when they do UX design for mobile and web applications. So what I remember one of Sophia's guests once said, like the rush to UI means like people, like they want to go straight to like wireframing, doing a low fidelity prototype and so forth. So which doesn't help us, in XR, because that's not what we do, so we need to stay more.
It is even worse to jump into UI.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's completely the wrong direction. So in XR, we need to stay on a different level to address the design world we're dealing with in XR, and that design world is object oriented. The reason why it's object oriented is because typically XR comes from a game design background, so done with game engines most of the time. And for that reason, I mean, game design and game engines are mostly object-oriented, based on object-oriented programming. So the terminology and the language is object-oriented. So if you stay object-oriented, it's a huge win, because you're already in that mindset of solving problems from an object-oriented perspective. And if you use the same mindset to use UX problems, that's a huge that's a huge win.
Absolutely.
That's why I think OOUX is the missing link.
So right now we kind of like jump over kind of on ourselves, right? In a way that like ahead of ourselves. So OOUX is the solution. So let's do one thing.
We're done.
Done. Bye, guys. No. First of all, I wanted to welcome everybody that is joined. So we have hi from Mannheim in Germany. We have Mustafa El Zaini joining on YouTube. So everybody is following us there. And Lisa Lombardi says yes. So we have got a bunch of people, and actually I welcome everybody to ask questions. So I'm gonna have the questions here. If there is something popping up, please interrupt us, because that's what we like. Be interrupted and get this as interactive as possible. So let's go back. While you guys think about your questions, let's go back to our questions in the meantime. And we talk about object-oriented UX. So Sophia, why don't you tell us what it is and what are the benefits? Maybe with an example, if you can.
Yeah, sure. So basically object-oriented UX is all about thinking about your objects first before jumping into your actions and all the things that a user needs to do in the system. So it's a way of dividing up complexity that I think just makes for a much more holistic experience and more holistic product on the other end. So what we tend to do, sort of traditional UX design, is we are still kind of thinking procedurally. We think about this thing that we need to make, and we think about all the things that a user needs to do, which is very important. At the end of the day, that's going to be the most important thing, is people getting stuff done. But to get things done effectively, people have to know what the things are they are doing that thing to. And how many times have you gone into a digital environment and you can't easily see what are the important things here? And when I say things, I'm not talking about UI components. I'm not talking about the nav bar or the footer or the homepage slider. I'm talking about the things that you actually came for, the real things of value. So are those things people, events, topics, sessions, maybe if it's some sort of conference site, right? So what are those things? What are you actually coming for? And it's about making sure that those things are really, really clear to the user, so that your interaction design basically is sitting on that really solid foundation of clear, consistent, recognizable things. And the process. So basically, the benefit is more intuitive user experiences, because when users enter any environment, no matter whether it's digital or physical, the human mind is very object oriented. So when we enter an environment, what we're going to do is the back of our mind, the visual cortex back here, very old part of our mind that helped us survive for hundreds of thousands of years. And that back of the mind is going to say, what are the things here, right? Are any of them dangerous? What are the things here? Is anything going to eat me? What are the relationships between those things? So we've got the what pathway in our visual cortex, which is basically saying, what are the things? And then we've got the where pathway, which is basically saying, is this thing behind something? Is this thing in front of something? Babies have to learn this when they learn object permanence, of something going behind something else, but it's still there, right? So we start learning about the relationships between these things, not just in placement, but also philosophically, what are the relationships between these things? How does a session and an event relate in a conference site?
Right.
How does a speaker in an event relate in some sort of conference site? So we're looking at those relationships. And then we also need to be very clear, what can I do to these things? We need to have clear affordances, which in the real world, very easy. What can I do to this thing? You have never seen this coffee mug before, but you can probably know exactly how to interact with this. We can't really say that, can we say that about the digital environments that we create, that everything the user immediately knows what they can do to those things? So object-oriented UX is all about making sure from a design process that we get really clear on all of that internally with our team. We're all speaking the same language. We all know what are the important things here. How do they relate? What can users do to them? What is kind of the chemical makeup of each of these things? What are the attributes, the properties of those things? So we get really clear on that before we go and start designing screens. And it really makes for a much smoother design process and a much better outcome on the end.
So I would say that is, based on what you're saying, is kind of like a base, right? So before you go in, that's like, exactly, that's our foundation. And I have a question. Would you say that OOUX is basically a way to create a conceptual model of the system?
Yeah, we are terrible with our words, right? So there's conceptual models, we've got mental models, we've got system models, we've got domain models, we've got entity relationship diagrams, we've got ontologies, and we are all very blurry about how we define these things.
So let's not attach to a definition, but let's have a common understanding.
Yes, we want to know, it's not just the conceptual, how a user thinks about the things, but also how the business thinks about these things, and realizing when there's any kind of disparity there. So we have the business process model and all the things that are important and valuable to the business. And then we've got the user's mental model and all the things that are important and valuable to the user. But at the end of the day, so I've done a lot of work in education technology, so in ed tech. And if I am creating an app for teachers, right, I need to understand what are the real things in her or his world, right? So what is it? And ethnographic research is great to figure this out, but a teacher has students, classes, lessons, lesson plans. If you're in the US, there's something called standards too. There's also parents, there's other teachers, there's even schools, right? So a teacher might go from school to school, depending on what solution. So there's all these objects in the domain, and I need to be really clear on what those are and how they all relate. I need to understand them. And then I have, what are the things in my system for the problem that I'm trying to solve? So maybe parents aren't in there, maybe other teachers aren't in there, maybe it's just students and lessons and lesson plans and homework assignments. But those things, when the teacher opens up my app, I want those things to be super clear. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. I am just trying to display the truth of this teacher's world in a way that's super clear, so that they can go ahead and start getting things done in this environment. They don't have to learn my my terminology, and I've made things up, and so I'm gonna keep this anonymous, but just the other day I was doing a mentoring call, and I was talking about the conference site because it was somebody that was working on a conference, and there were all of these things, like for example, they had stations and sessions, and a station wasn't defined in the way that I define a station when I go to a conference. I think of a vendor booth when I think of a station, right? And it was defined differently within this site. And I saw that as a big problem, because the mental model, how I think about a station, is different than how it actually works. So I could add a station to my calendar. I could add a station to my schedule. And I was like, that's not what I do to stations. I don't add them. I add events to my calendar or sessions to my calendar. So it is about matching that conceptual model, and then also thinking about the business model and seeing how those match up or don't match up, and doing that hard work of getting alignment there.
So this example was great, because now I kind of get it, because I tried to do some homework and understand, but now that you mention it, is like, how do you bring the reality back into a digital application, right? And so that basically the user is familiar to some extent with what he's going to face, right?
Right.
So
I mean, honestly, just if I can add one little thing, if if you have competitors solving the same problem, probably their system model, their model of objects is going to be very similar, if not exactly the same. But the competitive edge is who's going to execute on it better, who's going to make it more truthful to the end user, so that when I go into this place, I'm like, oh yeah, these are my things. This is just exactly how it works in the real world, but now I can do things to those things in ways that I can't in the real world. So I'm made into a superhero in a way that doesn't confuse me. I don't have to there's no learning curve. So I talk about when I worked on election results at CNN, I was the lead UXer in 2012 and in 2016. The information architecture did not change from 2012 to 2016, right? We still had our government was the same, right? We still had electoral college. We still have candidates and races and states and ballot measures, and they still connected in the same way. What we did is we just made it clearer, the truth of the actual of the world. That's not where I'm trying to get creative, is figuring out, let me create new objects and give new labels to those objects and connect them in ways that they don't necessarily connect naturally in the real world.
Clear. So then the question for Cornell. So how you have seen, what kind of use you see from this type of logic when you start designing for virtual reality or for augmented reality? Because certainly, right, you move away from a 2D interface and you are then in space, right, in different way. You could be completely immersed in space when you are in virtual reality. You can be partially, right? So you could have some an overlay of digital content in our world, then that's the moment that we're talking of augmented reality. But how does that object-oriented approach could be applied to this to designing for immersive technologies?
Yeah, so the way I see it is, the way I see OOUX is basically as OOUX is helping me with my information architecture, basically to bring order and structure into all these objects and things I'm dealing with, basically, right? And first of all, when you talk about designing XR apps, first of all, you have to be clear in what role you're designing, because when we're talking about the UX designer, basically the UX designer typically has two roles. One is very often, for example, when you see job openings for game companies that are looking for a UX designer, very often it's UI design, right? They want someone to redo their UI stuff, But we also have the UX designer as a product designer, So the UX designer as a product designer is basically designing the whole thing, he's designing the application, basically, right? Yeah. And traditionally, as I mentioned earlier, in XR, the product designer has very often been the game designer in XR, because XR comes from a game design culture, So basically, it's the culture is game design, the technology is game design, Most of the time when I deal with XR projects, they all have a game design background. They all come from game development. They use the same conventions. They use, game design is typically centered around the game design document, the GDD, which is basically the hub for game design. And it's just a different way of thinking. And if you use the perspective of the UX designer, it's a bit of a different angle, looking at product design, and because because UX design is more user-centric, obviously, you empathizing with user concerns, and that has become very important in game design too, because the game industry has changed, because since we have so many free-to-play games, the focus of game design has shifted from, originally games were like products that you put on a shelf at a retail shop, at a GameStop, people would buy a game product and it's a packaged product. But these days you have free-to-play games where, the conversion is a big deal. Basically, the UX becomes so much more important, That's why UX has become very important in game design. And for that reason, the role of the UX designer as a product designer has become very dominant in game design as well. But these are basically two conflicting, there's a bit of a culture clash because these are two different cultures, you know. Game design is one culture and UX design is a different culture. It comes from a totally different angle, you know. And sometimes they don't always love each other, you know. So it's kind of interesting I had a lot of discussions with game designers and UX designers over, you know, because there's a lot of overlap and because game designers they're saying like basically, hey, we do the same thing as UX designers. We do you know, we do research, we do user interviews,
sure.
We do all that stuff. We do all that stuff, you know. We do focus group tests. We've done that stuff for a long time. It's nothing new. But you know, of course, it's a different culture. It's a different angle. It's a different way of looking at things. And I think it's a huge benefit if you take that. You know, if you look at things from the UX design perspective when developing digital XR products, you know, because it's a success formula, because it has worked so well, you know. That's how I see it, you know.
No, and I feels like a deja vu in a way, you know. We are now in XR, what we were back in the web, right? Where there was the web in the 90s was this ugly place. Then, thank God, UX designer came in. They started making a more inclusive, accessible, streamline, just a more delightful experience. Driven by what? By the fact that consumers are craving for good experiences, right? And that is key. So like it was for the web, we still need to push and drive for it. I think that the same is what for example. Sophia, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that what it kind of boils down to is in the same way with the web, it went from kind of a novelty to a necessity. So it used to be that it was, we go to our chat rooms, you know, it's kind of, but now to function in this society, you have to have a certain amount of competence. Some things are internet only, which creates big accessibility issues and concerns. But what we have to do is now it has to be usable for everybody, not just people that kind of want to play with the novelty. So not to downgrade the work that game designers are doing, but it is a novelty and a privilege to be, you know, doing those games versus some of these new applications of this technology. It's going to become a necessity, or it's going to become something that people need to solve their problems. So this example that we were talking about before starting recording, I met a woman yesterday whose son, her 4-year-old son, is deaf and autistic. And she is 100% looking to these technologies to help solve her son's problems in communication, in understanding emotion, and learning sign language, and other people you know, who don't know sign language, being able to communicate with those people. So those are solving tough problems with where you need a whole different type of user research going in to understand a particular target market.
Of course, and a completely different set of tools and mindset. Cornell, yeah.
Yeah, what I wanted to add is, I mean, you're right about, you know, the relationship to gaming, but I wanted to add, of course, sometimes if you use, let's say, game development, it's also a bit misleading because there's other sides to game development than just fun, you know. Basically, there's also like serious games, you know, and, you know, simulation, but very often it's under the umbrella of game development because that everyone is used to these terms, basically, you know. So, like, for example, serious games and simulation is for basically for disaster prevention and these kind of things.
Military.
And also what you mentioned, military, that kind of things, you know, stuff we all need.
I mean, even this example of, I mean, if we were designing an application, a VR application to help Savannah's son learn how to read lips, for example, that could be a game.
Right.
Well.
Yeah, exactly.
It probably should be some sort of game. Yeah. So the edges start blending, we get this gray area between solving a problem, game design, and, you know, I think that there's some of that kind of different schools of thought, but coming together on that is just going to be so powerful when it comes to XR.
Yeah. So, and
I think
I think that I had a question now, because so for me and Cornell, we are kind of like on the other side of the barrier in a way. So we believe that everything is XR and XR is everywhere, VR, AR, but the truth it's slightly different, right? And I would be curious to know, and maybe also from the people that are listening right now, is what's the reality from the other side? So when you are surrounded by UX designer, UI designers that are now really that have built their expertise and their profession, their skill set within the 2D world, do you see them curious, like indifferent, or maybe like hesitant? Like, how would you describe the population of designers that are now unaware, right? No, I'm just thinking, right? I'm just thinking what could be all the possibilities. And indeed, what do you think about about this new world of design? Sophia, how does it look like?
Yeah, so and I also would love to hear what folks are saying in the comments for this as well. Like, what is the level of interest and awareness? I think that interest and awareness is high, but the day to day, it feels really far away, because I think it's just amazing when I'm mentoring and going through these certification programs and getting to know folks that are in the weeds out there in these enterprise corporations, even startups, and still the process is not working for basic screen design. The UX designers aren't getting a seat at the table. There's kind of like, I guess, bigger fish to fry, right? Like we're still working on getting a seat at the table, getting enough user research. Like we're still having to sell talking to our users. I mean, which feels like crazy in this day and age, but it's still happening by and large, that we're like, the fight now is not to like get budget to create a VR experience for my company. It's to get enough research for our like basic needs, and the fundamental problem we're trying to solve. We're still not doing a great job of solving that problem. So I think that there's like the day to day, it just feels like it feels far away, but I do think that there's a lot of interest. And there's a lot of appetite to learn more. I think everybody knows, and I'm just, speaking from my experience, that this is coming, that it's going to be coming, but it feels like, okay, 5 years down the road, this is going to start coming onto my plate. And right now I'm still just trying to get enough budget for research and enough time to do the work and enough time to think about information architecture. Budget for information architecture still isn't happening. We're feature factories a lot of the time. We're 1 week ahead of development. We need wireframes for this one screen. So we're still being asked to think about cogs in the machine, without thinking about the whole machine. And we have these very tight timelines. So we're just kind of like, I think the UX industry is still sort of on this kind of on this treadmill, and we haven't had time to like step off the treadmill and be like, oh, let's think about what life is going to be like for us in 3 to 5 years. Okay, so there is awareness, there is interest yet. People are still catching up with the system, right? Yeah. Okay. It still feels like we're catching up and we're doing things that like really should have been worked out in 2014, but still like we're still fighting the same battles. And I do see light at the end of the tunnel that those things are getting better. I think OOUX is helping with that, a way to kind of get information architecture thinking in a way that does feel iterative and feels like it could fit into some of these in these fast-paced environments, but still, it's tough. It's tough out there. Certainly tough. I have a question here. It says from Benjamin: this is specifically, I believe, for Sophia. Do you frame a user's tech literacy as an object or give it its own step in development? Can you repeat the question? The whole question is: you have discussed OOUX to frame IA and make interaction clear to user as soon as they use a product. Do you frame a user's tech literacy as an object or give it its own step in development? The user's tech literacy. That is such an interesting question. No, I don't think about it as an object within the system. I would put that on user research and understanding the user. Now, sometimes the user is an object in the system, And sometimes, we would think about, okay, if the user is an object in the system, if they're logging in, they have at least a username and a password as far as what attributes they have. Some applications will actually ask and say, what is your level of tech, probably not what is your level of tech literacy, but how are you using this application? So I think like even Evernote will say that when you create a new account, it'll ask you, what are you using Evernote for? And have you ever used Evernote before? So it does create some bits of information so that the user can tell the system how the level of comfort with the system, and then the system can adapt to that. But actually understanding as a persona, that will go in user research and developing your personas, which usually the system understands what role somebody is, and maybe through some onboarding questions can determine what persona they are, but most systems don't have that level of personalization.
Yeah. And this actually gives me an opportunity to ask a question to Cornell, because there is also like a big challenge when we are designing for XR, and the user XR literacy is a huge obstacles in a way. I mean, we are talking about a new world, right, where people have never been sometimes. Unlike where we are in 2D, we are still kind of to some extent used to have those skeuomorphic interaction. We know how the flow for a chat or for a messaging app kind of works. How do you deal with that when you design instead for XR? How do you take the literacy of or the technology literacy of the user into account? Do you design always for like if somebody steps in for the first time, or you find ways to adjust it? How have you dealt with that in the past?
Yeah, good question. So I think basically what it comes down to is we have certain conventions in XR, and these conventions are basically set by like benchmark applications like Half-Life, Alex, for example. So where the user has certain expectations of what the app delivers, and that these expectations are set, for example, what kind of level of customizations I'm getting, and that's the other point that's important is these days, the best way to address the user is to give options, In the early days of XR, especially VR, we had the problem that, the developers made a decision, for example, to only allow teleportation in an application, so the user can only teleport from one spot to the other spot. But some users don't like that. They just prefer smooth locomotion, like in first-person shooters, like using an analog stick. And there used to be a huge debate between these different camps. And these days we have come to a more mature state of the industry where we have certain conventions, and these conventions are that you give the users options to customize the experience, to basically to customize in a way that I would like to have teleportation, or I'd like to have snap rotation with a certain angle degree, and these kind of things. So there's conventions, heuristics, and we have, but the thing is in the XR, things are constantly changing. That's the other thing, So nothing is set in stone. So basically, something that used to be true like 1 or 2 years ago is like all of a sudden a different thing,
Yeah. So I have one quick question for Sophia again. Raul asks, is there a free tutorials available for OOUX?
Yes. So tutorials, working on it, but there's a lot of resources. So if you go to OOUX.com, there's a resources tab, and there's a getting started playlist there. That's gonna be where to start. That getting started playlist. Actually, the very first episode of the OOUX podcast is an audio workshop. So you can, sit down with pen and paper, and I basically talk you through a little interactive session. And I think that's the first thing on that playlist.
So then there is another question from Anuj. He asks, how close OOUX is with the OOPS concepts in Java or other programming languages like polymorphisms, inheritance, data encapsulation, abstraction?
Yes. Okay, I love it. So the original reason I called it object-oriented UX is because of the inspiration from object-oriented programming, and some of the benefits that I saw of object-oriented programming. I was like, oh, we need to be doing this too. We need to have encapsulation. We need to have reuse. It really all came from like kind of modular design and having reusable parts, and realizing like, oh, these two things on these two pages, if I want to change the position or I want to change the data behind it, the content behind it, I want it to update in both places, right? And then once we have some of that inheritance, we can even be smarter about that. So how can we do that from a design perspective? And amazingly, actually help communicate better with our developers. So it really is a bridge. Actually, in the certification program, I do have developers that want to learn more about UX, and this feels like a good way for them to bridge over. And then also a lot of people that are in the program say, the main reason that I'm doing this is to communicate better with my developers. So the object map that we create, where you say, okay, here's what the things are, and here's what all the attributes are, and all the relationships, that this like color-coded object map that I teach people to build is basically a really visual database diagram. So the cool thing is you can now build get your data organized from a user-centered perspective. And you can bring, and I'm 100% always evangelize that this should be a collaborative process with your developers and your business and your users. Like as UX designers, we just facilitate it. And then the cool thing is we build this data model together. And when it's time to build the front end, whether that is in voice or screens or VR, the user experience designers can work from that data model, and the developers can too. And now UX is no longer a bottleneck, because we don't have developers sitting around waiting for screens that they can then reverse engineer to figure out the data model. Like we all know the data model now. We've all figured that out. So yes, major corollary for sure with communication. Some of the words are different, like what I call an object, maybe a developer would call a class. But we do pull other things like junction objects is something that I teach. So when you have those many-to-many relationships, where do you, and with that many-to-many relationship, the relationship has data. What do you do with that? Okay, we need to create another object to house that data. So it is very technical in that aspect. But once I started getting into the kind of cognitive science research that I've gone down a whole rabbit hole with on how humans think and how the brain works, and that's the real reason to do this. Like better communication with developers, icing on the cake. But it's not just developers that are thinking in objects, and now developers are doing functional programming, extreme programming, and sometimes they're not even using OO languages anymore. That's cool. Human beings think in objects. Our users think in objects. The other people in our team, we think in objects. We're a very noun-heavy species, basically. So it helps communication overall. So really, object-oriented, yes, originally inspired from object-oriented programming, big corollary, but the real reason is that human beings are object-oriented.
So you touched upon a very important thing, and that is the importance of collaboration and communication in this kind of projects. So as it is right now, in 2D things have moved, right? So there are at least, for example, tools that allow to designers to communicate, to share their idea. It's getting there, right? And of course, there has to be a underlying system right, to facilitate that communication and to have a good use of the tool, because a tool used improperly, it's not going to lead to a good result for sure. In VR and AR, we are still on the opposite. So we are still in a world where basically everything is kind of like made, designed, taught by the developers, and this is one of the things that we at Voria try to change by building a tool to allow communication and to allow designers to step in, create their vision, share it in 3D in space so that others can get it. Now my question is in this case to Cornell is, how do you think we could get more designers in? Right, because there is curiosity, but there is this hesitation, right? And Sophia mentioned, well, it still feels it's far away. How do you think, Cornell, we could get more designers? Because we need more. we are in desperate need because the experience right now are just let's not say the why. Let's just say that we need more. Cornell, what can we do to change that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, good question, because I agree. And actually, in my new book, I talk about that. So I have identified prototyping as one of the big pain points, for XR designers, because prototyping in XR is not easy, so it's very often very technical. And if you compare it to 2D, basically in 2D you have the low fidelity prototype, you have the high fidelity prototype, and we can use the similar analogies in XR. We can have a low fidelity prototype, which is an ideation prototype, and then we have the high fidelity prototype, which is more an iteration prototype for usability testing, that kind of thing. And I think if we get really good at the first part of it, at the ideation prototyping thing, and that's actually what Tvori does really well, I think. So I think Tvori is really onto something here, because I think that this is going to be the key to getting more designers in, to actually allow designers to visualize how an app, what an app could be like, and basically to come up with a ideation prototype that you can present. Very often I think of environments that are very fast-paced, where people want to see something the next day or like within a few days, and you just have to come up with a UI and just like present, like pitch some ideas, that kind of thing. You have to think in terms of how the media industry works, like how ad agencies or marketing agencies work. They have different time scales than game developers, basically. People want to see things quickly and want to like have an idea to quickly, something to look at. And I think this is really where Tvori comes in, because we need applications to quickly visualize what, to give designers the tools to come up with ideas in XR, and that is a big problem at the moment, so that is a big problem. And I guess you guys are onto it to solve that problem,
That is one of what we are really pushing for. Yesterday, actually, I was in a session together with another designer. She was in the UK. I'm based in the Netherlands, and we were both in VR. And she said, "I've never been in VR before, but I'm getting more and more of this VR project on my plate, and I'm asked to work on them. So what am I gonna do?" And her description was that basically she ended up looking online and finding that, okay, you can do these things in Figma, but she just felt so unsatisfied, because like, but I don't know how it's gonna feel when I'm there, right? Because what story? How am I gonna tell that story, right? It's not even about the menu. It's not even about that. It's like, okay, what's gonna happen to the user when it's there? Right? So what is it gonna see? Which kind of environment is gonna be? So and it was fascinating. While I was kind of like guiding her to some of the basic features, I heard a bit of awe. Like, oh wow, that's nice. This kind of like spontaneous way. It's just because I feel that creating should be in VR should be as simple as in Figma, right? I mean, to sketch things up and to jot something down, it should be very intuitive and wouldn't require them to get those developers in with all the time and their own and their own interpretation, right? Because then, of course, when things get interpreted, there is one step extra and things change along the way. Sophia, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. So I think that getting into actually sketching out what it's going to feel like does feel to me more like that's UI.
Yes.
But so if you wanted to get more, OOUX, if you wanted to get more of kind of that information architect into VR, I think OOUX is a great way to do that, because basically you could seriously, what I said before, I'll say it again, that object map that you make where you've defined what the things are and the relationships and all the attributes and what people can do to that, take that to a screen, take that to VR, take that and doing that collaboratively with your developers and with the business of figuring out what needs to be in this environment. That's the first question. So, and you can sketch that out without actually going back to our Savannah's 4-year-old son. So if let's just go to, we're teaching deaf people to read lips. All right. So we want a VR environment we're teaching deaf people to read lips. So what are the things in that place? Like maybe we have like, is it faces or is it just kind of like funny disembodied lips that you can like pick from some of those disembodied lips? And then maybe there's stories. So you've got stories, you've got storytellers, which maybe we visualize as some sort of funny lips. We've got angles even. So like how somebody is angled. So maybe I can learn to read lips from this angle or this angle versus straight on. We've got attributes of those stories. What is the age level for those stories? So we might have a teenager who still hasn't learned how to read lips, right? But they need an easy story, but the content needs to, be more about like vampire love triangles and not about, bunny rabbits or something like that. So thinking through all of that information architecture on what are these actual things in this environment? What kind of attributes do they have? So just that story, how are we breaking it up? Okay, so maybe we even break that up by phrase, because how do we actually tell whether the end user is getting it or not? How do we sort of test them? So do you do a phrase and then they are wearing special gloves and then they sign that phrase? And then you're matching it up and you're saying, okay, we've got a phrase and then we've got a set of sign language. Do you get points? Then do we bring game, or do you get like some sort of artifact or like a puzzle piece, right? So as you go through the story, every time you get a match, you get a new puzzle piece, and then there's like a little game at the end, and then figure out, okay, how do like the puzzles and the puzzle pieces in this and all these things interact with each other? That can all be done before you're actually drawing pictures of these things. You're kind of in that abstract information architecture stage. And I think that's where like so much of that UX work comes in.
Yeah, Cornell.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I mean, the information architecture is a huge part of it, But I think on the other hand, like what Troy does is also is something. What Troy brings to the table is designing in context, So basically, and what designing in context means, basically, you're designing in VR,
Yes.
So the point is, finish, Cornell.
So basically, you're designing in VR. You're in VR, and you basically have the same perspective as a user. And sometimes these tiny nuances make a huge difference. Like how you position like a UI item, if it's like floating a little more or a little less, how the shadow falls. Like there's these little nuances that can make a huge difference in the look and feel. I mean, this is of course UI related, of course, but I think it's very important to consider how important designing in context is,
But it's also fascinating because I think we are also approaching a new way of really thinking about this problem. So the example that you brought up, Sophia, was incredible, because I think like imagine if we could be in a room and we could move and create any object that we would want, right? Then at that point we are not necessarily designing the app, designing the UI, designing the point system, but hey, we are in a room. This is or maybe is this gonna be in a living room or in his bedroom, for example? Is it gonna be outdoor? And then maybe we're going, okay, I think it's gonna be outdoor. Fine, where is it? There is a desk, there is that, and then it's not because you want to design the experience or like the UI or the specific object, but because you are thinking in space how the user is gonna feel in that moment. So then you're gonna have maybe is there gonna be someone else in the room, right? And then so all those thoughts, all those things, but instead of creating that information infrastructure as us, for example, Post-it, you could do it in space. We could do it in space together. So and this is one of the things that I'm kind of very excited, because it's just gonna bring a new way to design and think about problems. Because at that point, a designer is not hindered anymore by his limitation. Okay, I don't know how to use Blender, I don't know how to create 3D models. That's out of the way. So anybody can create, anybody can be in space and create that world together with others and maybe with the user. It's just a different paradigm, I think.
So I'm thinking about like what I would want. And so one thing that when we're doing our object mapping, we use Mural, and Mural has take notes. Mural has the noun project baked into it, so you can very easily like find 100 icons for anything you're looking for. So one thing I encourage my students to do is for each of your objects, come up with an icon for it, come up with a picture for it. Like if you can't draw a picture of the thing, like or if you find yourself drawing UI instead of like a person, a story, okay, so maybe that's like a book, you know? So what I'm thinking would be really cool is to be able to sort of like, you know, maybe it's just even circles. Like I'm like literally sketching out these things. Okay, we've got a set of lips, we've got stories, and we've got puzzle pieces, all right, and which turn into puzzles. And maybe I can just, I mean, is there a VR version of the Noun project where I can get like placeholders? So I like, okay, this is what a puzzle, we got a puzzle piece over here, we got the puzzle over here, we've got a set of lips over here, and we've got a storybook over here.
Yeah.
And I just get like, you know, the VR placeholder icon basically, right? Like the 3D version, but it's not the final thing, you know? We haven't gotten our 3D modelers on here and like, you know, so, and I'm starting to figure out how I might position those things. And then I would want some way to kind of like figure out the attributes on those things, like something like the lips, like what can a user make them go faster and slower? Okay, so like, oh, this is too fast for me to get right now. Like, let me slow this down. And how does are the stories and the lips independent? So maybe I can have this set of lips that's more like, you know, somebody that talks like this, you know, a little more advanced set of lips. But I want this story, like how do is it represented as a book? Or maybe the story isn't represented as a book. Maybe it's some sort of like magic bubble that I like pop into the mouth, right? And then the story comes out. Or you know, is it something else? Do we use some sort of other metaphor? So letting me kind of play with that and be like, okay, how does it feel to like take one of these bubbles off of the story shelf and like throw it into one of the mouths, and then that like comes forward and I can kind of play with it that way. But
Sophia,
not without like without the final version of these things.
I'm very looking forward to kind of like that. You really, as you mentioned, like before the recording, you get one of those Oculus, and maybe also any of the people that are now listening that are curious how to design, because a lot of the things that you just mentioned are to some extent already possible. So it's not even the future. I mean, these sketching these icons and put them in space and maybe use some metaphor to indicate how fast those lips goes or how the bubble reacts when you throw it into the mouth of those into that mouth. So all these things are already possible, and I'm just so looking forward to get people like you that can imagine, right? Because that's what we need. We need imagination. So absolutely. I do have one more question. I think, given that XR can be delivered to different devices, is OOUX a way to develop an omni-channel design that can support different environments? Whew. Michael,
yes.
That's yes. Next question.
Yes.
Yes, I think. I mean, I don't know.
Absolutely,
Yeah, Cornell, take it over. I think.
Yeah, I mean, like basically, I mean, due to the abstraction layer, I mean, that's what the OOUX is basically for. Basically, you know, that's why people use OOUX to not to commit too early to any platform or device, to keep it on a higher abstraction level and before committing to anything, you know. So I think, or Sophia, how would you put it?
Yeah, I have a student who's working for the Canadian Broadcasting Service, CBS, I think, and they're working on some voice UI. She's using OOUX for voice. It changes a little bit, you know, because then you have to think about all the synonyms. Like with the OOUX, we're very, very religious about our labels. Like you're going to call it this one thing. If you're going to call it an event here, you're not going to call it a session over here. You're going to call it an event in both places. But with voice, we have to like then start thinking, okay, what are all the 24 words that somebody might use to call this thing, because we don't have that visual feedback. And then all those attributes, then we think about, okay, if we have a radio station, what are the attributes? The radio station has a host, the radio station has a next episode, the radio station has a genre, the episode, what questions, like if we have duration of an episode as a piece of metadata, how might people ask about that? So there's like, you know, how much longer do I have in this episode? That somebody might ask that, and we're going to leverage duration to be able to answer that question. Right. So, you know, there's a little bit of nuance there in how we use the object map to kind of take it to the next level. And I think the same would apply for VR as well, or AR. You could build out that structure, but then when you need to go take it into prototyping, you're going to need to be asking different
slightly
types of
different
questions.
And I think it's also a discovering process, right? I think that your second voice project, you are gonna use those learning, right, to then apply it back, that you don't have to kind of like reinvent the wheel because you already adapted it to that kind of scenario.
Right, yeah. It can really be that foundational piece for you doing your voice app, doing your mobile app, doing your VR app.
Absolutely. So look, I am personally very excited. I don't know if we still have couple more minutes, so please guys, if you have any other question, ask. But personally, I'm just really excited to get people and to reach out a broader audience when it's about getting more designer on board, because that's really what we need. And if I have maybe just one thing to say is, do not get scared away. I think, because I think that VR got more accessible, right? Right now we have headset that you can get with $350. I mean, it's a very affordable, fairly affordable, likely more affordable than the phone you have in your pocket, right? That could easily be. And tools are coming, and so like Tvori, like depending also on what kind of world you live in, right? Maybe you are a product designer. Well, there are tools to do physical product design, right? So I think that the time is really changed, and it's going to change in the upcoming months. So maybe one last question to both of you, Cornell. What advice? What is that makes you excited for the coming, let's say, 6 months to 1 year, when looking about this conjunction between XR and design?
So I think we're at a very exciting time at the moment. I think we are right before things are going to explode. I think the job market is going to be on fire soon, for UX designers, especially for XR products, because like every industry is going to want an XR product, because we're in the middle of a huge shift, and I don't think it's 5 years away. I think we're talking about like a year to 2-3 years. I mean, 1 to 3 years. And I think what's super exciting is that right now it's mostly gaming, but I see a huge potential in educational applications. There's a lot of stuff that can be done. There's a huge potential medical applications. So this is all opening up now, and it's a super exciting time for designers to make their mark, basically.
And if I can chip in, it's fascinating. Like right now, I think one of the changes is going to be the new wave of augmented reality glasses. There are now already on the market. There are Unreal, and Facebook is coming, Apple is coming. Who's going to design for those applications? Are we going to get developers to ruin this? Because ruin it in a way, right? we know what's the mindset, what's their skill set. We need more designers. But what about you, Sophia? What makes you excited about the upcoming 6 months?
I mean, just this conversation has been really inspiring, and I am very excited, I guess, to get more designers thinking object-orientedly, to prepare them for this inevitable future. So I guess kind of like the advice that I would give to everybody listening, totally, from my from my chief evangelist of OOUX perspective, is start applying these object-oriented principles to whatever is in front of you. It's probably not a VR application. It might be redesigning a page for the bank that you work at or something like that. But you can apply those object-oriented principles, and it will start training your mind to think like this, so that if you're interested, when those jobs start coming up, I think that you're going to be a lot more prepared for that kind of work if you're already thinking about objects.
Yeah, and I think this is, I've got a question. I think it's a great way to end this, because Karishma asked me, what are the best resources that a non-VR UX designer can use to get started with? And this is gonna end this, because I would say that Cornell has a book coming in June, and he's gonna be back with us with Tvori to talk about more in detail about the book, and in general to build basically that resource that is updated, right? It didn't stop on 2015 because that's when it seems like the world stopped. So Karishma, stay with us in a way, keep following totally what we're doing, look at what also Cornell, connect with him on LinkedIn, and then absolutely. So stay with us, and I want to thank both of you. Thank you very much for this very insightful and energetic hour, and I look forward to have you and maybe have a streaming next time in VR. Why not?
Yeah, good idea.
It might seem, and I mean it might seem like this is the future. Oh, no, I'm telling you right now, we could get a headset, we could go in VR, and we could start designing. It's not the future. Yep. It's gonna happen. It's happening now. So really, for all the people that are in there, stay tuned, because there is really, we live in exciting times.
We do.
Thank you very much, Cornell. Thank you very much, Sophia.
All right.
You're welcome.
See you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot, huh?
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stream is ended.